The night was quiet in the way only a desert can be, not peaceful but empty, the kind of silence that presses against your ears like static. A young Marine stood at his post, elevated above the darkened valley below, scanning the terrain through a pair of night vision goggles that turned the world an unnatural shade of green. His breathing was measured, controlled. 2 years of training had taught him to manage everything: fear, fatigue, uncertainty. He had done this dozens of times before, stood watch while the rest of his squad slept in rotations behind him. He adjusted his grip on his rifle, rolled his shoulders, and then, without fully understanding why, he stopped moving. Something had changed in the air, not the temperature, not the wind. Something else, a quality to the darkness that hadn't been there a moment before. He remained still and let his eyes settle on the rocky ground below the post. Nothing moved. He switched from night vision to thermal imaging. Scan left, scan right. The landscape returned only the ambient heat of the earth. He lowered the optics slowly and stood there in the dark for a long moment, listening. And then the dog started barking. She was pointed directly at the southern perimeter, a fixed, rigid posture, the kind that comes not from aggression, but from recognition. She wasn't barking at a sound. She wasn't barking at movement. She was barking at something standing still. The Marine raised his thermal scope again. He swept it across the exact position she was fixated on. There was nothing there, but the dog did not stop. If the kind of historical storytelling you just heard is something you value, the careful research, the restraint, the respect for those who serve, we'd ask that you consider subscribing to this channel. It takes considerable time and effort to bring these accounts to you with the weight they deserve. Your support allows us to continue doing exactly that. By 2009, the war in Afghanistan had entered its 8th year. What had begun as a swift military response to the attacks of September 11th had evolved into something far more complex. A counterinsurgency operation spread across one of the most geographically hostile environments on Earth. The Helmand Province, located in Afghanistan's deep south, had become one of the most contested regions of the entire conflict. Poppy fields stretched across its flatlands, irrigated by the Helmand River. The Taliban had deep roots here, cultural, tribal, financial. Coalition forces have been attempting to hold the province for years, but the ground never stayed won for long. The terrain was merciless. Summer temperatures in Helmand regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The land was flat in places, broken in others. Sudden ridgelines, dry riverbeds, scattered mud-walled compounds with no clear indication of whether the people inside were civilians, combatants, or both. The dust was constant. It worked its way into everything: weapons, eyes, lungs, radio equipment. In this environment, small units of Marines were assigned observation posts, elevated positions designed to provide surveillance over key areas of terrain. These were not forward operating bases. They were not fortified installations with generators, mess halls, and internet access. They were exposed positions. A handful of men, a radio, a sight line, and the expectation that they would hold their ground. Marine units rotated through these posts in cycles, typically 60 days at a time. The isolation was deliberate and tactical, but it was also total, away from the larger base. Without the routine of organized operations, the days collapsed into a monotony broken only by guard shifts and the occasional contact report. In the summer of 2009, a squad of 8 United States Marines was assigned to one such position in Helmand Province. It was a post they had heard mentioned before, though never in detail. It sat southeast of Patrol Base Hassanabad, elevated slightly above the surrounding terrain. NATO forces had seized it from the Taliban the previous year. A British unit had been holding it prior to this handover. The position had a name. The Marines called it Opie Rock. What the official mission logs recorded from the following 60 days was largely consistent with standard observation post operations: guard rotations, radio communications, patrol activity, no significant enemy contact. The reports were unremarkable. What the men who served there remembered was something else entirely. Official records do not fully match lived experience. Word about Opie Rock had circulated among Marine units in Helmand Province for months before the 2009 rotation arrived. Soldiers who had passed through the area reported that the post had an unusual quality, one that was difficult to articulate but consistently described. Some recalled feeling an unease that set in almost immediately upon arrival. Others described a sense of being observed from just beyond perimeter, in directions where the thermal optics returned nothing. A Marine who served at an adjacent patrol base recalled hearing the post referred to informally as the haunted Opie, casually, almost dismissively, in a way that soldiers discuss things they cannot fully explain and cannot afford to dwell on. The British soldiers who preceded the 2009 Marine rotation were said to have mentioned the post's reputation during handover briefings. The specific content of what they communicated has never been formally documented. What was noted by multiple sources is that the departing British unit appeared, in the words of one Marine, disheveled and eager to leave, in a manner that did not match a standard end-of-rotation handover. Afghan locals in the surrounding area had their own understanding of the site. Villagers near the town of Amir Aga, situated close to the post, were reportedly reluctant to discuss the location in detail. Local interpreters working with coalition forces occasionally reference the ground itself as cursed, not as folklore or casual conversation, but as a factual caution they believed necessary to pass along. Several refused to approach the site's perimeter after dark. None of this information made its way into official reporting. These were the kind of accounts that circulated informally, in billets, during transit, in the margins of conversations between men who had been to the post and men who were about to go. Similar observations appear consistently across unrelated groups: British soldiers, American Marines, local Afghan forces, and civilian interpreters, none of whom had coordinated their accounts. To understand what the Marines reported at Opie Rock, it is necessary to understand what the ground beneath them actually contained. The post sat atop a rocky mound approximately 100 feet above the surrounding terrain. What appeared to be a natural formation was, on closer inspection, something more structured. Medieval arrow slits were visible in the stone on its eastern face. The remnants of fortified turrets suggested that the mound had once served as a mud fort, one that had likely been built upon, collapsed, and built upon again across centuries of use. Local accounts held that the site traced its origins to the era of Alexander the Great, who moved through this region in the 4th century BC. Whether or not that specific attribution is accurate, there was no question that the ground had been strategically occupied for an extraordinarily long period of time. The more recent history was documented, and it was severe. During the Soviet-Afghan War of the 1980s, the rock and its surrounding terrain had been an active combat zone. Mujahideen fighters used the elevated position as a defensive post. Soviet forces attacked. The violence was sustained and close. When NATO forces arrived and began digging defensive trenches into the site in 2008 and 2009, they uncovered what the ground had been holding: human bones, not scattered remains, not a single burial. Marines who participated in the excavation described pulling up femurs, intact skeletal structures, fragments of pottery, and Soviet military equipment. Tent stakes still bearing Cyrillic lettering. The New York Times, which covered the post in the 2009 report, noted that forensic assessments suggested the remains came from multiple historical periods, some potentially centuries old, some consistent with the Soviet-era conflict, and some from the more recent fighting against the Taliban. The Marines had, without knowing it, established their position atop what amounted to a layered burial ground. They reburied what they found. They told their successors to avoid certain areas. One detail, however, did not fit neatly into this historical accounting. The dog, a stray the Marines had adopted and named Ugly Betty, had no knowledge of the burial sites. She had not been told what lay beneath the ground. Yet she consistently reacted to specific areas of the perimeter in ways that her handlers could not explain. Not to sounds, not to movement, not to identifiable stimuli. She reacted to locations. And the locations she fixated on were, in several cases, the same positions where her handlers later discovered human remains. That detail was noted. It was not resolved. The history of Opie Rock as a site of violent death stretches back further than any living memory. The Soviet-Afghan War, which lasted from 1979 to 1989, was fought with brutality that left lasting marks across Helmand Province. Soviet forces deployed extensively in the region, attempting to suppress Mujahideen resistance fighters who used the terrain with familiarity and precision. The elevated position that would later be designated Opie Rock changed hands multiple times during this period. By accounts passed down through local oral tradition, a group of Mujahideen fighters was killed at the site during a Soviet operation in the early 1980s. The Soviets, according to these accounts, occupied the position afterward until the Mujahideen recaptured it. The Soviet soldiers who were taken did not leave. Local sources described ritual executions carried out at the post during the reconquest. Their bodies left in the ground. When the Taliban later consolidated control of the region, the pattern continued. A group of communist police officers, local forces who had collaborated with the Soviet-backed government, were reported to have been executed at or near the site in 1980. The number cited in regional accounts was 40. That figure was never independently verified. What was confirmed, through physical excavation, was that the ground beneath the post contained remains consistent with multiple eras of violent death from different individuals, buried at different depths and in different orientations. The Marines who were assigned to the post in 2009 were not briefed on this history before their arrival. By the time they began digging their defensive positions and the bones began to surface, they were already 2 days into a 60-day rotation with no realistic option for reassignment. They reburied what they could. They marked the areas they knew. They continued their mission. The nights that followed were not like any nights they had experienced before. There is no responsible examination of accounts like these that does not engage seriously with the science. Combat environments create conditions that are, by clinical standards, extreme. Sleep deprivation alone, which is endemic to extended observation post-rotations, has been documented to produce hallucinations in otherwise healthy individuals within 72 hours. The continuous guard rotations required at Opie Rock meant that no Marine was receiving more than a few hours of uninterrupted sleep at any given time across an entire 2-month period. The heat in Helmand Province in summer is not merely uncomfortable. Sustained exposure to temperatures above 100 degrees causes measurable cognitive degradation, reduced processing speed, impaired judgment, heightened emotional reactivity, combined with dehydration. Even at subclinical levels, these effects compound. Isolation is its own variable. The psychological literature on small group isolation, particularly in high-threat environments, consistently documents the emergence of shared perceptions that are not independently verifiable. Groups under stress develop heightened sensitivity to ambiguous stimuli. Sounds that would not register in normal conditions become significant. Shadows assume shapes. The brain, under sufficient stress and fatigue, becomes an unreliable narrator. Add to this the knowledge, once discovered, that the ground they were living and sleeping on contained human remains from multiple conflicts spanning centuries, and the psychological preconditions for unusual perceptual experiences were fully present. These factors explain many reports from combat zones. They are real. They are documented. They deserve to be taken seriously. But they do not explain everything that was reported at Opie Rock. They do not explain why separate units, rotating to the post without coordinated communication, describe the same specific phenomena in the same specific locations. They do not explain why the accounts of the Afghan locals, who had no contact with the Marines and no access to their radio communications, describe the same areas of the site as sources of disturbance. And they do not fully account for what happened during the final weeks of the 2009 rotation, when experiences at the post moved from individual and ambiguous to collective and verifiable. These factors explain many reports, but not all. The Marine designated in accounts as Corporal Lena was serving as the squad second-in-command during the 2009 rotation. By his own account, shared years later in interviews and in a documented public statement, the The first weeks at Opie Rock were marked by a gradual accumulation of things that, taken individually, seemed manageable. A sound over the radio that no one had transmitted, a temperature drop that localized the specific points on the perimeter isolated from the ambient heat, a smell described consistently by multiple Marines as the smell of decay that appeared and disappeared without traceable source. Lena had taken responsibility for Ugly Betty early in the rotation. The dog was, by military working dog standards, an informal asset, not trained, not certified, but reliably reactive to perimeter intrusions. She had alerted to Taliban scouts during previous rotations. Her behavioral patterns were consistent and observable. Several weeks into the deployment, Lena was on watch. It was past midnight. The valley below the post was quiet. Ugly Betty began to bark. Lena raised his night vision goggles and scanned the southern perimeter. He identified what appeared to be a human figure standing approximately 300 meters out. He switched to thermal imaging. The thermal scope returned nothing. He switched back to night vision. The figure was still there, but closer, not approaching in the measurable, trackable way that a person crossing ground would appear. Closer in a way that a frame of film is simply replaced by another frame. He did not call it, and immediately, he continued to watch. The figure did not move in the subsequent minutes. It stood. It remained oriented toward the post. And then, without transition that Lena could observe, it was no longer there. A forensic psychologist reviewing accounts like Lena's would note that the human visual system under low-light conditions is susceptible to a well-documented phenomenon called pareidolia, the tendency to perceive meaningful patterns, particularly human forms, in ambiguous stimuli. Night vision equipment amplifies ambient light, but also introduces artifacts, particularly at range. What Lena perceived as a figure may have been a feature of the terrain, a rock formation, a scrub brush, a distortion in the optics. That explanation is rational. It is grounded. What it does not account for is that when Lena returned to the post the following morning and walked the location where he had observed the figure, he found the ground undisturbed. No tracks, no impression in the dust, no physical indication that anything had been standing there. He noted this. He told his squad. Nobody suggested it was nothing. Opie Rock did not produce a single anomalous report from a single individual. The consistency of the accounts, across different service members, different nations, different time periods, is what elevates this case beyond the purely anecdotal. The British Welsh Guards who occupied the post before the 2009 Marine rotation documented, in informal reports that later surfaced, a pattern of disturbances consistent with what the Americans would later describe. Radio communications receiving transmissions that originated from no identifiable source. Visual phenomena in the southern perimeter after dark. A persistent sound, described by multiple British soldiers as resembling footsteps on loose gravel, that continued when no personnel were in the areas from which it seemed to originate. A Marine identified in accounts as Diggs was on watch several weeks into the 2009 rotation when he heard precisely those footsteps, loose gravel, unhurried, approximately 20 meters from his position. He turned. He expected to see a fellow Marine returning from the latrine or moving between posts. The area was empty. He dismissed it. Then Ugly Betty began to growl in the exact direction from which he had heard the sound. She held her posture, rigid, fixed, pointed, for over a minute before relaxing. The thermal optics returned no heat signature. A Marine who served at a different outpost in Helmand Province, not Opie Rock, described a near-identical sequence of events in a separate account recorded for a veteran oral history project. He had no prior knowledge of the Opie Rock accounts. He was stationed at a different position, in a different sector, during a different year. Same sounds, same dog behavior, same absence of thermal signature. Vietnam-era veterans have described parallel phenomena in the dense jungle terrain of Southeast Asia, particularly in areas that had seen concentrated casualties. The specific experiences differ as terrain and environment differ, but the behavioral pattern is consistent. an absence of identifiable stimulus paired with an animal reaction that suggests the presence of something the human observer cannot detect. This pattern appears across theaters, across decades, across conflicts involving different nations and different cultures. What the science has not produced is a unified explanation for the consistency of the pattern. The rational explanations for what Marines reported at Opie Rock are neither dismissive nor implausible. The most straightforward environmental explanation centers on the physical properties of the site itself. Opie Rock sat atop a collapsed tunnel and cave system, partially destroyed by a 2,000-pound bomb dropped by U.S. forces during the initial seizure of the post. Underground cavities, even collapsed ones, can produce acoustic phenomena, sounds that appear to originate from the surface when they are in fact traveling through subsurface channels. The footstep sounds described by multiple witnesses could, under this model, have been the geological settling of the damaged substructure, amplified and directed by the cave system's remaining geometry. The unexplained lights reported by multiple units, flickering illumination in areas with no power source, have been attributed by some researchers to a phenomenon called St. Elmo's fire, or to the electrical effects of dry atmospheric conditions combined with the movement of charged particulate matter, which is common in the dust-heavy environment of Helmand. The lights described at Opie Rock were small, localized, and appeared primarily at night, consistent with low-level electrical discharge in a dry, particulate-heavy atmosphere. The smell of decomposition, reported by multiple Marines during random intervals throughout the night, has a partial explanation in the physical facts of the site. Remains were present in the ground. Remains decompose. In extreme heat, decomposition gases can migrate upward to the soil in unpredictable patterns, producing odor that appears and dissipates without visible cause. Each of these explanations is credible. Each addresses a portion of the reported phenomena. What none of them fully addresses is the behavior of the dog. Ugly Betty's reactions were not random. They were directional, consistent, and temporally correlated with the phenomena reported by the Marines. Dogs do not respond to geological settling or atmospheric electrical discharge with the posture of prey detection. The behavioral profile she demonstrated, fixed orientation, sustained attention, absence of vocal aggression after the initial alert, is consistent with the detection of a specific stimulus of biological origin. That stimulus was never identified. The last week of the 2009 rotation at Opie Rock, the squad had been there for over 50 days. The accumulated fatigue was total in a way that only extended field operations produce. Not sleepiness, but a kind of erosion. The edges of things had worn down. The days had flattened. The men did their jobs, maintained their posts, communicated with the base. They were, in the clinical sense, functional. On one of the final nights, the exact date is uncertain in the accounts, a Marine was on watch in the late hours. The valley was still, the temperature had dropped from the day's extreme, and the air carried the particular clarity of a desert night, where distant features appear closer than they are. He heard it before he saw anything. Not footsteps this time. Something more diffuse, a quality of sound that he later described haltingly as resembling a crowd heard from a great distance. Not loud, not clear, more like the memory of sound than sound itself. He stood very still and listened. Ugly Betty made no noise. She was awake. Her head was up. She was watching the perimeter. She was not barking. The other Marines on the post were asleep. He considered waking them. He did not. He raised his night vision goggles and scanned the terrain in a slow, methodical arc. The same arc he had performed hundreds of times over 50-plus days. The landscape was empty and still and green in the optics. And then, to the south, at the edge of the rock formation, there was a figure, not ambiguous, not a shape in the shadows that might be a rock or might be a person. A figure, standing, oriented toward the post. He kept the goggles on it and did not move. The figure was dressed in a manner inconsistent with Taliban field dress. The posture was not the posture of a scout or a forward observer, who would typically be low, mobile, and using cover. This figure stood upright, openly, without apparent concern for the Marine who was watching it. He switched to thermal. Nothing, He switched back to night vision. The figure was still there. He reached for his radio without taking his eyes off the position. He made contact with the base and began to report an unidentified individual at the southern perimeter. While he was still on the radio, he looked back through the goggles. The figure was no longer at the edge of the rock formation. It was closer. He did not hear it move. He did not see it move. It had simply resolved to a position that was nearer to the post, with no observable transition between the two positions. He continued the radio transmission, keeping his voice level. He reported the figure's new position. Then the gunfire started. It erupted from the east, an intense, close burst of automatic weapons fire, followed almost immediately by the acoustic signature of a rocket-propelled grenade. The Marines came awake instantly and took defensive positions. They prepared for an impact. They held their ground. The impact never came. The gunfire stopped as abruptly as it had started. The silence that followed was complete. The Marines held their positions for what one of them described as a very long time. Not minutes, but the kind of extended waiting that combat-trained individuals understand as its own particular experience, in which every second is accounted for and time does not pass evenly. When they cleared the perimeter, they found nothing. No spent casings, no impact craters, no physical evidence that weapons had been discharged anywhere near the post. The surrounding terrain, dust and rock, which in that environment would show the disturbance of a single person walking, let alone the aftermath of an armed engagement, was undisturbed. The Marine who had been on watch when it began said, in a later interview, that he did not go back to the southern perimeter until it was light. He did not explain why. He did not need to. Of the 8 Marines assigned to Opie Rock in the summer of 2009, most returned home and resumed their lives with varying degrees of difficulty, as veterans of extended combat deployments often do. 3 of them did not survive the war. They were killed in subsequent engagements in other parts of Afghanistan in the years that followed. Sergeant Green, the squad commanding NCO, was severely wounded by an IED strike after the rotation at Opie Rock. He survived, though the injuries were permanent. Several of the surviving Marines have, in interviews and public statements, suggested that something changed during those 60 days, not in the war, not in their understanding of combat, but in something quieter and harder to name. The post itself was decommissioned eventually, as the nature of the conflict in Helmand shifted and the tactical value of individual observation points evolved. The bones remain in the ground. The locals who live near the site continue to regard in the way they always have, not with curiosity, but with a settled, inherited understanding of people who have lived adjacent to a particular kind of place for a long time. There is no official account of what happened at Opie Rock in the summer of 2009 beyond the mission logs. What exists are the memories of the men who were there, memories that have proven in the years since to be remarkably consistent across time, across distance, across the particular ways that individual people choose to make sense of experiences that resist sense-making. The dog, Ugly Betty, was not taken home. She remained in the region when the Marines rotated out. What became of her is not recorded. The rock is still there. The valley around it is still quiet at night in the way deserts are quiet, not peacefully, but emptily. And somewhere in the ground, layered beneath centuries of conquest and retreat, of bodies placed by enemies who became the conquered and then the dead themselves, the earth holds what it has always held. It does not explain itself. It does not need to.